Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Robert Ezell, Director of the Washington State Emergency Management Division, and I'd like to welcome you to the NEMA webinar, Integrating Unmanned Aerial Systems into Disaster Response. Thank you for joining us today, and now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter. Greg Nelson is the founding owner of Greg Nelson Consulting, LLC, a strategic planning consortium specializing in catastrophic disaster response planning and emergency management operations. Greg is an executive consultant with C-level experience in interagency, intergovernmental, civilian, military, domestic, and international collaborative planning. Greg retired from the United States Air Force as a brigadier general with over 20 years experience in homeland security, international humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief. Brigadier General retired Nelson held numerous senior leadership positions, including command of the 123rd Airlift Wing, Director of Mobility Forces for both the United States Northern and Central Commands, and Vice Director for Strategy, Policy, Plans, and International Affairs for the National Guard Bureau. Greg holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from the University of Louisville and Master of Science in National Resource Strategy from the National Defense University. A Harvard Kennedy School alumni in executive education, he is currently studying toward a PhD in management. Thank you for being with us today, Greg, and I'd like to turn the presentation over to you at this time.
Thanks, Robert, and thanks, Karen, for organizing this webinar today. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our West Coast and Pacific Island audience. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today about integration of unmanned aircraft systems capabilities into disaster response operations. As mentioned, my presentation is intended to provide an executive-level overview of UAS rules and regulations and the requirements for requesting approval to use unmanned aircraft systems prior to, during, or after a disaster or emergency in your state, territory, or district. Now, I'll start off the presentation by providing some examples of unmanned aircraft system supports during actual disasters, and I'll discuss some of the technology development and possible applications in the future. Then I will go into the rules and regulations governing unmanned aircraft systems operations in the United States and give you the details on the request and approval process for flying unmanned aircraft systems during a disaster in your state, territory, or district. I'll close my presentation with what I feel is going to be the most important takeaway, and that's that you need to include unmanned aircraft systems in your state disaster response air coordination planning. This is in order to deconflict UAS flights with your other disaster response air operations. Now, before I get deep into the presentation, I want to express some thanks for some support of some friends from the FAA, FEMA, Air Force Northern Command, 1st Air Force, and the National Guard Bureau, along with the authors of multiple articles from the Emergency Management newsletter. There's several reference slides at the end of this presentation, but I'm going to apologize up front if I fail to provide credit or citation for any of the information in my presentation. As all of you know, information from an aerial view is critical to any large emergency or disaster. Unmanned aircraft systems are able to access hard-to-reach areas and gather data in an environment that may be unsafe or impossible for humans on the ground or manned aircraft from above. But the major benefit of using unmanned aircraft systems instead of manned aircraft is the vast difference in cost. Cost estimates for a manned helicopter range anywhere from $400 to $1,200 per hour, compared to as little as $25 an hour for a small unmanned aircraft system. A helicopter purchase can cost $800,000 versus a relatively sophisticated UAS purchase for about $1,700. Additionally, an unmanned aircraft system may be able to respond more quickly than a pilot of a manned aircraft. A UAS can launch from any area close to the scene compared to a manned aircraft located in an airport. And unmanned aircraft systems eliminate some of the concerns for pilot safety and the hazard of large amounts of flammable aircraft fuel. Unmanned aircraft systems have been used for disaster response in other countries for several years. After Hurricane Sandy passed through Haiti in 2012, unmanned aircraft systems aerial imagery was used to assess the flooding, identify collapsed housing areas, and identify areas of standing water for mosquito and epidemic control. Some of this imagery was recorded by U.S. military MQ-1 UAS systems provided by Air Force Northern Command and 1st Air Force. In 2013, Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines was one of the most powerful typhoons in recorded history. Rotary winged unmanned aircraft systems were used to identify where non-government organizations or NGOs could set up camps. They helped identify which roads were passable for transportation and logistics, and they helped assess which villages suffered the worst damage. In June of 2014, the United Nations Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or UNOCHA, purchased their own small quadcopters for use in humanitarian response. A recent example in the United States was the use of UAS to survey an entire Florida city in less than 2 hours after a Category 3 storm. The city of Daytona Beach Shores is currently training police officers to operate small unmanned aircraft systems to locate missing people, find suspects, or for search and rescue. Their officers are going to be FAA licensed, and they've obtained the FAA certification to operate in the airspace around the city. I'll explain the details of these requirements later in the presentation. In 2014, a mudslide roared through the rural area community of Osa, Washington. It destroyed 30 homes and took the lives of 43 residents. It literally turned the entire disaster zone into quicksand. This left most of the response area unsafe for ground crews. Unmanned aircraft systems were used to create 3D mapping, which identified safe routes for first responders to the entire area. Also, geologists could use the 3D mapping to detect the pace of continued land movement well after the initial event. Unmanned aircraft systems have been used and can be used for countless disaster response applications. Now, following is just a small list of UAS applications. Aerial search and rescue, or SAR operations, as I've mentioned. Disaster assessment of critical infrastructure, including roads, bridges, railways, airports, cell towers, and even energy facilities. UAS have identified hazardous materials and done analysis on their corrosion or their effect. Law enforcement uses unmanned aircraft systems for multiple missions at crash sites, perimeter security, the use of non-lethal during day and night support at public events, and helping firefighters assess heat sources in a burning house. New technology is being developed every day for unmanned aircraft systems, thus increasing their value to the emergency managers. Groups of unmanned aircraft systems can be linked to provide a temporary communications infrastructure in and around and over the disaster area. These aerial cell phone towers can provide long-term support for cell phone and Wi-Fi services, not only to the first responders in the areas, but also survivors in the disaster zone. Software is being developed using algorithms to scan data for changes, such as land movement mentioned in the Washington State mudslide, hazardous material corrosion over long periods of time, and simply to identify a small hole in the fence that possibly wasn't there before. Intelligent flight planning software is being developed to provide organized, focused flight area direction for the unmanned aircraft systems. Research is being conducted to develop teams, what they call, it's a combination between the UAS and the first responders, and human UAV teams. This is going to suggest immediate course of action simultaneously to both the first responder and the unmanned aircraft system. Organizations of professional unmanned aircraft systems operators are linking individual independent aerial footage in what they call crowdsourced collection. Now, they're working efforts to make this, to provide this information of collective data mapping via free open source systems. Now, hopefully this introduction of UAS capabilities, some examples of their use and future applications during disaster response, is going to entice you to learn more about the basic rules and regulations governing unmanned aircraft systems. Unmanned aircraft systems are regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration, much like manned aircraft. Now, during my research, I found this one-stop website published by the FAA, and it really provides a wealth of information on the Federal Aviation Administration's guidance for unmanned aircraft systems rules and regulations. Simply www.faa.gov/UAS. The first point I want to explain in the rules, they're very different for anybody that's flying unmanned aircraft systems for personal use, or let's say for fun, or commercially for work. Unmanned aircraft systems have different rules depending on their weight, their use either privately or commercially, for government use or for military. There's all different rules. As an example, all aircraft owned by agencies, offices, or subdivisions of either the United States, any state, territory, or District of Columbia must be registered in accordance with Part 47 or Part 38 of Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations. These are the same rules that govern manned aircraft and registration. Now, this doesn't apply to unmanned aircraft systems owned and operated by the U.S. Armed Forces. The military has a completely independent and different set of rules and regulations. This table explains some of the different requirements of the operator or the UAS pilot, the unmanned aircraft system aircraft itself, where you can fly the unmanned aircraft system, specific flight rules, and most importantly, the FAA legal and regulatory guidance. And this is Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 107. Now just remember the name Part 107. I'm going to use that as reference for the rest of this briefing. And all government organizations, the FAA, they know when you reference Part 107 what you're talking about. Now I'll go into more detail of Part 107 when I discuss the request and approval process for using your UAS during a disaster response. Now on this table I've highlighted some of the main points, such as one, the pilot's got to hold a remote pilot airman certificate or a UAS operator's license. The unmanned aircraft system must be under 55 pounds or won't be considered a small unmanned aircraft system, which gives a lot of leverage in these rules. UAS weighing over 55 pounds require registration just like any manned aircraft. The unmanned aircraft system must be operated in Class G airspace, which we'll explain more on the next slide. It must be kept in sight at all times, must be flown below 400 feet. It can only be flown during daylight hours at a speed less than 100 miles per hour. And probably the most important note on this slide, must not be flown over people. Now this last point should draw some concern on how you're going to be able to use your UAS during a disaster without flying over people. I'll explain this more in the request and approval section. This slide explains the FAA definition of various airspace classifications. As you can see, Class G airspace is about the smallest and closest to the ground. It covers from the ground to not more than 1,200 feet above ground level, depending on the class of airspace around it, above it, around airports, or around large populated areas. Now, in addition to Class G airspace, unmanned aircraft systems can be flown with FAA approval in what they call special use airspace, restricted areas, or military operating areas. Now, you're going to need an aviation expert to help you identify these areas in your state or territory that you want to use unmanned aircraft systems for training and exercise, and then in the event of a disaster response. I'm not going to get into any more of the details on FAA flight rules for unmanned aircraft systems. Just suffice it to say, you want someone trained and licensed to operate the UAS, and they must understand and abide by the Federal Aviation Administration National Airspace System, or NAS, systems and regulations. To assist both the novice and professional U.S. operators, the FAA developed a smartphone app called Before You Fly. Now, this is pretty cool. Before You Fly is a free download, easy-to-use smartphone app. It helps unmanned aircraft operators determine whether there's any restrictions or requirements in effect in the location where they want to fly. And there's multiple functions that will help you plan your UAS flight. Before we leave the basic introduction to UAS rules and regulations, you need to research any additional guidance, laws, policies, or regulations governing UAS operations in your state, territory, district, county, city, or literally your local area. Emergency Management Magazine has published several articles supporting unmanned aircraft systems capabilities for emergency management and law enforcement, but they also have referenced either existing legislation or developing regulations and guidance for different states, cities, and counties. Bottom line, know your local rules in addition to the FAA federal guidance. Now, getting into the request and approval process of the briefing, we're going to continue with our FAA discussions because they're the first organization you're going to have to contact and coordinate with for approval to operate your unmanned aircraft systems in your state, territory, and district. Then I'll brief the process to request military assets that may be located within your state, a neighboring state, or nationally available. Government organizations or government entities. This includes law enforcement agencies, state government, local municipalities. You got two options to fly your unmanned aircraft systems. Now, you can either fly under the restrictions of the small UAS rules that I briefed on the previous table a couple slides ago, but you're going to want to obtain what's called a blanket Part 107 Certificate of Waiver or Authority, or COA. The acronym is COA. It's pronounced COA. This COA will permit you to fly your unmanned aircraft systems based on the details in the request that you submit and what's approved by the FAA, such as for exercises and training. And most importantly, having an existing blanket COA is going to allow you to obtain an emergency COA or ECOA during a disaster response. I know this is going to get complicated, but the bottom line, or the main point, is you want to have a blanket Part 107 COA to train and exercise with unmanned aircraft systems in your state, territory, or district. And having that training and exercise or blanket Part 107 COA will allow you to get an emergency COA during a disaster response with more leverage to fly the aircraft exactly the way you're going to need it. The COA application has got to be very specific in the location where you intend to fly your unmanned aircraft systems, specific altitudes you'll fly, and the purpose for use of the unmanned aircraft systems, i.e. training and exercise. You should submit your application at least 60 days before you plan to start flying any UAS. Now, this is going to allow the time for the comprehensive review by your local FAA air traffic facility, the Associated Service Center, and the FAA headquarters. The FAA COA, again, is the most important document you need to remember from this briefing. Blanket COA lasts for up to 2 years, and again, having the blanket COA in place will allow you to request the emergency COA to fly your UAS in a time of a disaster. The COA application process is online. It's pretty straightforward, and it can be assessed from the website that I gave you earlier, faa.gov/UAS. An emergency COA is an addendum to an active blanket COA. It's requested through an expedited special government interest process, SGI process. The emergency COA or ECOA guidance was just published by the FAA last October. You can surf what I've got listed up there on the slide, the FAA Air Transportation Order, JO 7200.23, October of 16. Pull that up, go to page 15, and it's got all the instructions for requesting an emergency COA. You must justify in your application on why the standard 60-day process is not feasible. The FAA recommends, purely urgent need to fly a response mission within 14 days or less. When approved, the new emergency COA guidance and authority is going to be augmented or authorized through additional FAA air traffic control actions, either publication in their daily notice to airmen or NOTAMs, or the application of a temporary flight rule or TFR in the area you're going to fly your unmanned aircraft systems. Mr. Robert Sweet is a friend of mine. He's a manager at the FAA Systems Operations Security Office, which is the office where you will request your emergency COA. In a telephone discussion with Mr. Sweet, he said that the FAA wants to support the state's emergency manager's interest in implementing UAS capabilities during a disaster response. But the FAA's main concern is the airworthiness of the UAS equipment and both the operator to fly within the national airspace or the NAS. Mr. Sweet strongly suggests that states apply for and receive the blanket 107 Part COA to operate their UAS before a disaster for training and exercise. Then in the validated emergency, his office, the Systems Operations Security Office, they can provide an expedited emergency COA in as little as 1 to 2 hours. Mr. Sweet explained that in a major disaster, the Federal Aviation Administration, in coordination with the state, local, and federal authorities, will implement temporary flight restrictions, or TFRs. The temporary flight restriction, or TFR, is an area both around and above the disaster area that maximizes flight safety into, out of, and within the disaster airspace. For military unmanned aircraft systems, the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense published Policy Memorandum 15-02, as you see on the slide, titled Guidance for Domestic Use of Unmanned Aircraft Systems. This policy memorandum provides all the requirements for using military unmanned aircraft systems for disaster response in the U.S. It also explains the process for requesting Secretary of Defense approval. This guidance applies to all Department of Defense unmanned aircraft systems used in the U.S., whether they're operated by active or reserve component military personnel. And this includes your state National Guard. Use of military unmanned aircraft systems also require the FAA blanket or emergency COA that I previously briefed. In addition, the military organization has got to submit what's called a Proper Use Memorandum, or PUM. This ensures that they're going to comply with all intelligence oversight's guidance prohibiting information collection on U.S. citizens. Department of Defense unmanned aircraft systems may be used for Homeland Defense, defense support of civil authority, and National Guard support to federal, state, local, and tribal government organizations if approved by the Secretary of Defense. Now, governors are encouraged to include DoD unmanned aircraft systems in their disaster response planning, but they need to also factor in the procedures and time for Secretary of Defense approval, and they must coordinate their plans with FEMA, Northern Command, or Pacific Command plans for their states, territories, or districts. Before Secretary of Defense approval, before the Secretary of Defense makes his decision, the request is routed through the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Northern Command and Pacific Command, depending on the geographic location, the Chief of the National Guard Bureau, if it's a National Guard asset, and the appropriate military department secretary, be it the Air Force, Army, Navy, Coast Guard, whatever service owns the individual unmanned aircraft system. So as you can see, this is a timed process. It will be expedited, but it's not going to happen in seconds or hours. The Secretary of Defense approval process must include a specific UAS routing, altitude, concept of operations, and reference to the blanket or emergency COA from the FAA. The state, territory, or district will request the use of DoD UAS support through their Defense Coordinating Officer, their DCO. If approved, the UAS support is provided through the Mission Assignment Process, or MA process, like other federal support. Now, the only exception to the requirement for Secretary of Defense approval is a search and rescue mission involving distress and potential loss of life. This is immediate military coordination by either Air Force Rescue Coordination Center, Alaska Rescue Coordination Center, or the Joint Rescue Coordination Center in the Pacific. Dr. Mark Lilly is the ISR Systems Chief at Air Force Northern Command, 1st Air Force, at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. In a discussion, Dr. Lilly told me that Air Force Northern Command, 1st Air Force, can provide a large MQ-1 or MQ-9 unmanned aircraft systems that can fly up to 20 hours. Depending on their location, 3 aircraft could provide 24-hour coverage over a disaster area for an extended amount of time. The aerial information would be transmitted from the unmanned aircraft system itself to Northern Command in Colorado and into the State Emergency Operations Center within seconds. I think it's about a 1 to 2 second delay between the actual aircraft going through North Command, Colorado, down to the state within the EOC. Dr. Lilly recommends an Air Force Northern Command or a DoD liaison be located in your State Emergency Operations Center Air Operations Branch, or your AOB. This liaison would coordinate the UAS flight directly within the state EOC. Now, Dr. Lilly and I discussed the tactical, operational, and strategic use of UAS information and the differences. He suggests specific movement direction of that unmanned aircraft should be a tactical direction from the first responders on the ground through the EOC directly to that aircraft operator. Now, I discussed that that's got to be based on the operational priorities, and inevitably the information is going to be collected and provide direction for strategic decisions. Any state EOC can function as the focal point for the actual control of the camera and coordination with the field units for the Department of Defense UAS. National Guard unmanned aircraft systems require the same approval process as active duty assets. The governors may not use their state National Guard unmanned aircraft systems without Secretary of Defense approval, period. Regardless if the soldier or the airman is in state active duty status under Title 32 or Title 10 of U.S. Code for their performance of duty. The use of that equipment has got to have SecDef approval. The governor may submit his or her request in writing to the Secretary of Defense, and then the same coordination process will occur that was previously briefed. Now, purely as an editorial note, there may be a lot of political influence on where the governor's request should be routed. FEMA, NORTHCOM, National Guard Bureau, the FAA. Each of these entities will want to know about the request, and each of these entities sincerely wants to support the request. And inevitably, all these organizations and agencies are going to be involved in the approval process. But nothing precludes the governor from making a direct phone call to the Secretary of Defense for use of these assets. Now, I know that Florida, Mississippi, California, and Alaska have included their state National Guard unmanned aircraft systems capabilities in their civilian state emergency management plans. The Mississippi National Guard used their unmanned aircraft systems during their Patriot South exercise in January. The Florida National Guard is requesting approval to use their unmanned aircraft systems during their annual hurricane exercise next month. In February, I spoke with CW3 Dustin Williams, which is the senior UAS operations technician for the Army National Guard. He suggested the state's National Guard unmanned aircraft systems capabilities should be included both in the Adjutant General's All Hazards Plan, along with the state's civilian emergency management plans. This should include the FAA public or blanket COA and the details of the Military Proper Use Memorandum, or PUM. Now, this is going to expedite the support to the governor if an emergency special government interest COA or an emergency COA is needed. Well, the final section of my presentation is going to reinforce some of the things previously mentioned in reference to including unmanned aircraft systems in your state emergency management plans. Regardless of your aviation experience, I hope this presentation has demonstrated the complexity of coordinating disaster response air operations. Unmanned aircraft operations is just one of several contingency air operations missions your state's going to need to fly during a major disaster. Now, these missions are going to range from pre or post-event general population air evacuation and reception, large logistics airlift and staging, or even possible airdrop to remote stranded populations, air medical evacuation or reception, aerial search and rescue, and now unmanned aircraft systems operations. The unmanned aircraft systems rules and request and approval procedures should be included in your state air coordination plan or your state ACP. Additionally, your state ACP should include reference to the FEMA Air Operations Guidance, the FAA Airspace and Air Missions Management Guidance, Northern Command or Pacific Command Guidance, depending on your geographic location, National Guard Bureau Air Operations Guidance, and then collaboration with your bordering states' disaster air operations plans. For coordination collaborations, a massive amount of aircraft that are going to fly into your state, territory, or district in the first days or weeks of a catastrophic disaster. As mentioned previously by both the FAA and AFNORTH subject matter experts, you should plan to include a liaison from the FAA and the Department of Defense in your Air Operations Branch or your AOB of your Emergency Operations Center. They'll not only assist in unmanned aircraft systems operations, but they'll also help in the coordination of airflow into your state. Your State Air Coordinations Plan, or your ACP, should include both airspace management and air mission management. For airspace management, your ACP should include such things as fixed-wing, rotary, and unmanned aircraft systems altitude deconfliction, specific mission routing for each of the missions, entry and exit communications procedures, along with other basic flight safety guidance to ensure the flight safety of all aircraft flying in support of a disaster or emergency. For air mission management, unmanned aircraft operations should be deliberately planned in coordination with all the other potential disaster response air missions that I've previously mentioned. This includes identifying the specific airports to be used for the different missions. You can't just plan one airport and to fly everything out of. The diagram that I've used here is from the U.S. Geological Survey of the New Madrid seismic zones, which includes the 8 surrounding states. For an example, if a New Madrid earthquake occurred, the Federal Aviation Administration, in coordination with these states, would place a temporary flight restriction or a large bubble over the disaster area. The state and the federal government would use different airfields for various disaster response operations. The example on this slide shows airports that are in the disaster area within the temporary flight restriction, outside of the disaster area, or possibly on the border. In the Madrid earthquake scenario, some aeromedical evacuation aircraft could be positioned with search and rescue aircraft operations. Now, these are usually tactical airlift, small fixed-wing aircraft, and rotary aircraft. So they don't need to be planned at a large airport. They should be planned near the urban area in the disaster zone. Large airports with excessive ramp space and close to interstates and rail systems should be planned for logistics or large mission staging areas. And medium to large airports with newer facilities that can support persons with disabilities or access and functional needs should be planned for your general population evacuation and reception. Now, this leaves the question of where you position unmanned aircraft systems. If they're small UAS aircraft, they can be positioned in any paved area close to the disaster, school parking lots or mall parking lots. Not necessarily do they have to be at an airport. Some unmanned aircraft systems could be co-located with your search and rescue operations to provide mutual support, or possibly co-located with aeromedical evacuation aircraft, again, to provide the mutual support. The large MQ-1 and MQ-9 aircraft briefed by Air Force Northern Command of 1st Air Force are probably going to be staged at their home military base or military base close to but outside the disaster zone. They've got the legs for long flight time and long duration over a specific disaster area. Bottom line, your immediate air operations will save lives in a disaster in your state, territory, or district. So you should invest in the plan to make them successful. Now, in conclusion and summary, during this presentation, I provided some historic examples of unmanned aircraft systems used in actual disaster response in the United States and abroad. I also introduced some of the new technology and possible future applications of unmanned aircraft systems. Presented a brief introduction to the rules and regulations for flying unmanned aircraft systems in the United States. Then I explained the need to have an approved FAA blanket COA in place to train and exercise with unmanned aircraft systems, and then the process to get a special government interest emergency COA for unmanned aircraft systems used during a disaster response operations. I briefed the requirements by the Department of Defense to have not only the FAA COA in place, but also to have the proper use memorandum or PUM to ensure the intel oversight. I explained the requirements for Secretary of Defense approval for use of all Department of Defense unmanned aircraft systems for disasters in the United States, and the process for Governor to request that Secretary of Defense approval, and then the mission assignment process or coordination through the National Guard Bureau for National Guard assets. Lastly, I concluded by emphasizing the need to deliberately plan your state, territory, or district disaster response air operations. Inclusion of unmanned aircraft systems operations in your state HCP and collaborative deconfliction planning for all air operations is critical. Now, thank you for the opportunity to present this talk today about the integration of unmanned aircraft systems capabilities in disaster response operations. I hope my presentation provided an executive level overview and understanding of how you as emergency managers can incorporate unmanned aircraft systems in your disaster response planning and actual operations. Again, I want to thank my friends for their input in the development of this presentation, and my sincere thanks to NEMA for hosting this forum and asking me to present this information. Robert, I think this is the time that I'm supposed to turn it back over to you for some questions and answers and open discussion. Thanks again.
Hey, Greg, thank you. Great information, and really appreciate the research and the expertise. I found it very informative. There's some great technical information presented, and I think that we can certainly benefit from some back and forth and exchange of questions and answers. What I'd like to do, Greg, you spark some thought on my part as I was listening to your presentation. If an emergency manager has no previous experience with unmanned aircraft systems and no aviation background, how would you suggest they get started, and what would you suggest as first steps that they could be looking at?
Thanks, Robert. That's a good question. I would suggest the first thing they do is contact the individuals within their state, within their organization. Reach out to their Air Operations Branch, their ESF1 or Department of Transportation to inquire, to find out if they've initiated any unmanned aircraft programs for their state, territory, or district. If they haven't on the civilian side, then I suggest they inquire within their state Army and Air National Guard with the same question. So hopefully someone within the state has begun some unmanned aircraft systems planning, or you might find that they've already incorporated some training and exercise and have existing COAs. Their second step, if it doesn't exist already, is they need to direct that unmanned aircraft systems be included in their state deliberate planning. Hopefully their state has an air coordination plan, and if they do, they need to start adding UAS along with all the other air missions that I mentioned, evacuation, AE, search and rescue, etc. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, it does, Greg. Thanks. Editorial opinion on my part. I certainly believe that UAS is really the wave of the future. As you mentioned in your presentation, we saw its use back in 2014 in Washington with the State Route 530 slide, and then just most recently I've watched aerial footage that we've been using in our flood situation in eastern Washington, where they've been using UASs to determine extent of flooding, water coverage of roads, damage to bridges. And so, I think it really is a pertinent and timely topic. And I've got a question posted from Roy Shrout, and I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. And his question is, what do you recommend for a local jurisdiction and how best to proceed in getting access to fly in the FRZ? Okay, good question. Local jurisdiction. Again, I was amazed when I read a lot of the articles from the emergency management newsletters and other articles published on UAS is the amount of local guidance, regulations, and jurisdiction that's being published. So I would reach out within the Department of Transportation to find out what guidance is being published specific to your local area. But again, that FAA website, the www.faa.gov/UAS, is going to provide a wealth of guidance and additional information on how to get started if you haven't done anything before. The COA, the initial blanket COA application, you're going to have to define the area that you're going to exercise and train your unmanned aircraft systems. And the FAA is going to be pretty restrictive on where you can do that. You're not going to be able to fly it around an airport for training and exercise. You're not going to be able to fly it around certain parameters of our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. So you've got to look at the restricted area, and as I mentioned in my briefing, military operating areas. Those are areas that are specifically dedicated for military aircraft operations. And chances are you could get authorization to fly your unmanned aircraft system for training and exercise in those areas. Special use areas identified by the FAA. If you are a private pilot, then you'll know that there's areas somewhere out in a remote section where you can go out and learn to fly, actually perform stalls, different aerobatic maneuvers, etc. So that's where you're going to get authorization for your blanket COA to fly that UAS. They're not going to let you fly that UAS anywhere close to a large city, over or around an airport, nation's capital, etc. So hopefully that answers the question. There are going to be flight restricted zones that you're not going to be able to fly under your blanket training and exercise COA. An emergency COA is a different story. That's going to be coordinated directly, literally probably through phone call with the FAA Systems Operations Security Office in discussion of where the emergency is and the authorization to fly. Let's take another question, and this one is from Tim McClung. In the COA discussion, were you referring to the Part 107 waiver authorization process or a COA independent of the Part 107 regulations?
Yes to both. Initially, the first COA that I explained is exactly what he said. It is a Part 107 certificate of waiver and authorization. It's kind of funny. They added the waiver after some further development of FAA guidance. But the Part 107 COA, the first COA that I briefed, is what's called a blanket COA. Now that's the first thing that the state should apply for and have in place, and it lasts for 2 years. Now this will be let's call it a training and exercise COA. This is going to be very restrictive. It's going to literally be defined by the actual area, by latitude and longitude, corners, and then the altitude block from the ground to as high as you want to train, and what you will train in there, the altitude you'll fly, exactly what you're going to be training. So that's all going to go in that first certificate of waiver and authorization, or Part 107 COA application. And it's going to be very restrictive, but it gives you that initial authorization to start training and exercise. Now, having that in place is going to allow you, through the governor's request, through the FAA process, to call the Mr. Suite in Systems Operations Security to modify that or adapt that to an emergency certificate of waiver and authorization, or an ECOA. Now that ECOA is then going to broaden the aperture on what you're going to be able to do with your unmanned aircraft system. Again, you've got to define the area that you're going to be flying over, and it could be an entire devastated city, or it could be a remote area for search and rescue, which will define your area, the altitude you anticipate to fly, and then the mission you're going to fly. And it's going to be life-saving, information intelligence, or information assessments and awareness, search and rescue, et cetera. So there's 2 COAs. They're both under Part 107. One is your blanket COA, which is good for 2 years, and then the other is the emergency COA, which you'll use to fly your UAS during the disaster response for that specific application.
Okay, thank you, Greg. I have another question now from Wade Goff. And his question is, please clarify this as a resource contrasting DoD use against private sector supply, as many companies are popping up with this capability and resource for disaster response. And as a follow-on, does this compete? What is different, and how do you have any examples of formalized contracts, government to private sector, to use UAS in disaster response? So first part of the question is competition between DoD and private sector resource provision, and the second would be examples of formalized contracts.
I will take the second question first, and tell you that I do not have any specific examples of formal contracts between government organizations and private entities. Now, going back to the first question, yes, there are a lot of companies that are getting in this business, both individuals, like I've talked about. There is collective organizations of private unmanned aircraft systems operators, and then there is actually companies that are getting in the business of supporting government organizations with unmanned aircraft systems and their information capabilities during disaster response. Like anything, this is new and developing technology. So I would suggest for the emergency manager, number one, find the expert, find your aerial expert within your organization, either within your department, within your emergency operations center, air operations branch, within your Department of Transportation, possibly law enforcement, or your National Guard, and talk to them about applying for a Part 107 certificate of authorization and all the details engaged. Then the decision is going to be up to you, and I think he mentioned it in his question. It is going to be purely a resource decision. Does the emergency manager, in the state, do they get into this business? Do they go out and they buy their own unmanned aircraft systems and, have it standing by to use under their own ownership, their own pilot certified, et cetera, et cetera? That's going to cost, not only funds, but also time. So I would definitely suggest they coordinate with their state National Guard, because their Army is going to have, I guarantee, I think one of my slides showed the amount of the small unmanned aircraft systems that are owned and operated by all the state's Army National Guards. And then there may be a larger unmanned aircraft system owned by your Air National Guard. But regardless, your National Guard forces are going to have some familiarity with this system. So that's going to kind of give you the anticipated capabilities and the maybe the resource requirements, and again, the timing that would be necessary to use those in training exercise and emergency, and then go do your research. See if there's a commercial operation out there. Wouldn't cost anything for a phone call or get the information. And then it's going to be the emergency manager's decision. Now, I know that the ultimate controller of airspace and air mission management, the national airspace, is going to be the Federal Aviation Administration. So whoever you use for unmanned aircraft support in your state, territory, or district, again, back to one of my points, you want an expert, you want them licensed to operate the UAS, and you want them familiar with the FAA guidance and regulations, restrictions of the national airspace. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Do you have any closing comments or guidance you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, Robert, thanks a lot. First of all, I appreciate the opportunity, again, to present this information. There is a wealth of capability that this unmanned aircraft system can provide to the emergency manager in a matter of seconds. The developments are going to continue every single day, and it is going to be an asset for the emergency manager for years in the future. Now, however, like any other disaster response capability, they got to include it in their delivered plans. I mean, if they're going to use this, they need to deliberately plan it, identify it in their air coordination planning in order to collaborate unmanned aircraft systems with the other manned aircraft operations. There's an information and technology development inquiry just came out by the Air Force, and it identifies a kind of a quandary right now with unmanned aircraft systems that they are so new and unfamiliar that sometimes there's a hesitance to include them with other manned aircraft operations. I think that's a downfall. I think they can be complementary. The unmanned aircraft capabilities simultaneous with manned aircraft operations is just going to be exponential for the support for the emergency manager. So get into the books, learn about it, have your experts included in their deliberate planning, and literally, I mean, I'll be glad to work one-on-one with anybody that wants any additional assistance in their unmanned aircraft systems planning.
Okay, Greg, thank you. We do not have any further questions being asked, so I think that let's conclude the webinar at this point, and I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for the NEMA webinar series, and Greg, a special thanks to you for sharing your tremendous experience and expertise with us. I found it really, truly informative, as I'm sure did all of our attendees. As a reminder, there will be a short survey when we close, so please take a moment to share your thoughts. Thank you all again, and please enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.